Hello and welcome to this Ranger 4 webcast. Today we're talking about why, in the words of Gartner, ARA, that's Application Release Automation, is a key to DevOps. Today's webcast is brought to you by myself, Helen Beale, Head of DevOps at Ranger 4, and my colleague Mark Roberts from IBM, a DevOps and UrbanCode expert. The webcast will be 45 minutes long today. To begin with, Mark is going to talk to you about why people do application release automation and tell you a little bit more about the UrbanCode tool from IBM. Then he will perform a 10-minute UrbanCode demonstration for you, and then I will tell you a little bit more about the Ranger 4 DevOps readiness assessment. So, over to you, Mark, for your presentation and demonstration.
Thank you, Helen. Well, good morning. Now, hopefully you can see my screen if I just go into presentation mode and just ask Helen to confirm that she can see that in presentation mode now.
I can.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to give a brief introduction to some of the issues around DevOps that we've been coming across as we speak to customers, and then we'll go into a demonstration of the IBM UrbanCode Deploy product to show you how we can create a level of automation that simplifies development and accelerates deployment. Now, what we often find when we talk to customers is that there are gaps in the process. There are gaps between customers and business owners. There are gaps through from the different parts of an internal organization, from business owners into development and test, and there are gaps into operations and production. And there's a very simple way to explain really the differences that we find is that as IBM Rational, we've been speaking to development organizations or development departments in many organizations for many years. And as soon as we have widened the conversation into operations, we suddenly found ourselves on different floors of buildings speaking to completely different teams of people. And operations really has become an opportunity to meet new people and to explore other parts of an organization, and that's not really the way that it should be. There should be a better tie-up between development and operations. There should be a closer synergy between these two teams. Now, the crux of the question to ask a lot of customers in this particular area is, how long does it take if you had to make a snap release of your application today? How long would that take? If you found some critical defect in your application, if you found that your competitors were doing something specific that you needed to come up with a solution for, how long would it take? And customers sit back and give that question a little bit of thought, and the answer we often get is around sort of 4 to 6 weeks mark. Now, these are often customers who have told us that they have embraced Agile development. They have stand-up meetings. They have close collaboration between business owners and the development teams. But what they don't have is the ability to get those applications into production quickly. And sometimes that's for good reason, because they often find that they have rigorous testing to go through. It can often take a long time to get environments created to do that testing activity. They may also need to have access to third-party applications and third-party systems that it can be difficult to get access to. So all of that adds up to an awful lot of time. Now, trying to address these two gaps between the line of business and development and operations, we've done a pretty good job on the first gap. If you think about ways that we've solved that particular problem, we've introduced techniques of agile development that have drawn line of business users into the development teams. The best way to really understand whether you've addressed the requirements correctly is to show it to someone, show the application to them running, and you will often get a response of, oh, you've done it that way, or now you've showed me what I asked for. That's not really what I was looking for. I need it done in this way, and you've misinterpreted my requirements. So agile development and lifecycle traceability across the lifecycle of development have done some great things to close that gap. The ability to relate a single requirement to how it's being implemented, to how it's being tested, to then create defects against that and feed that through the life cycle gives us a lot of rich information that development teams need. But it's the second gap that we're trying to address today, and this is what we're trying to address with our DevOps solutions. Now, with Agile development, we often hear teams describing continuous integration processes that can take a developer's commit of some new source code changes, run automated build processes, run some developer-centric testing activities, and generate binary objects that are validated and proven. If you talk to someone in operations, they will often say, well, thank you very much. There's a huge raft of these new builds coming through. There's binaries coming through every few minutes as developers commit changes, but we can't do anything with them. So we have this huge funnel effect whereby we are slowing down the adoption of these new builds and the ability to push those through formal testing, functional testing, acceptance testing, performance testing, security testing. All those sorts of things are hampered by the amount of time it takes to get these things deployed into operational environments. And that's what we're trying to address. So I've created really this notion of this sliding scale really of a continuous delivery adoption model, whereby customers will find themselves at a certain level across this hierarchy. Now, many will have common source code control systems. Some may have a variety of different systems they use. Most will have some form of automated build process, the ability to build the application. Many customers will have continuous integration processes whereby content is committed to the source code control system. It's then automatically built and verified and validated, and there's a degree of testing going on in that. But then we move on to other areas, such as the automated delivery of those continuously generated binary objects into the first environment from which we can start to run some real testing. And those don't necessarily have to be particularly complex environments. They can be quite simple and straightforward. But then we move on to the continuous delivery into the first environments from which we can test, continuous delivery into production-like systems. So here we're introducing the notion of the fact that we have a system that will replicate production and it's something that will provide load balancers, multiple application servers, distributed database systems, and finally we have a continuous delivery throughput through to production. So it's a sliding scale where customers will find themselves at some particular point along there. What we want to get to, obviously, is everyone at the bottom, where we have a fast throughput mechanism to deliver quality code that's been through rigorous testing activities that reach to production as quickly as it sensibly and possibly can. So the IBM Rational solution in this area focuses around a new acquisition that was made by IBM earlier this year, and the product was, the company that was acquired was UrbanCode, and principally to get access to a couple of products that UrbanCode make, which was the Deploy product and the Release product. Now, we're not going to go into the Release product today. I'll mention it briefly a little bit later on if we have time, but really today is to focus around the Deploy product. And what I'm going to try and do is give you the Deploy product in its most simplistic format, in the simplest way I can to describe what it does. So ultimately, we break down, or we identify what we want to deliver, and we call that an application. So you can start to think now of applications within your environment that you wish to deploy. And those applications then break down into a number of individual components. So the individual component parts might be some web content, HTML pages. It might be some application that runs as an EAR file or a WAR file or a jar file that needs to be deployed into an application environment. There will probably be some database content as well and database table changes to be deployed. And there could be some more complex middleware such as WebSphere MQ, WebSphere Broker, and various other different platforms and technologies that you need to deploy onto. So what we need to do is identify the resources that you wish to deploy onto. We need to identify the content that needs to be deployed, and we need to identify the process that you're going to go through to actually perform that deployment. So I'm going to move across now to a different screen. I'm going to close down PowerPoint for a second, and I'm going to bring up my virtual machine running UrbanCode Deploy. So just for confirmation, Helen, can you see UrbanCode Deploy now on screen?
I can, with the tabs at the top of the browser.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is IBM UrbanCode Deploy. It's a web browser-based application, so every user accesses the application via a browser. It has a centralized server to which we all log in, and it has a number of agents. And the agents run on the end node points that we wish to deploy application content to. So it's very easy to size the application out. We typically will have a single server for each individual customer that's using the application, and then there will be a number of node points. And installations of that will vary from, we have customers that have 10 or 15 agents running to customers that have many thousands of agents running. Now, to start with, let's turn to the sort of operational side of the house to begin with. And let's start off by looking at some of our resources that we have for this particular application. Now, what we can see here is that I've kind of broken down the data center that we have, or the data centers that we may have, into a hierarchy that represents them. So at the top, I have UK to identify the UK data center. In there, I've got London. And then I've broken that down into specific machines that I'm going to deploy some content to. So if I close this up a little bit to start with, we've got two environments that I'm deploying onto, two machines that I'm deploying to at the moment. One is identified as development, one is identified as integration. Now, moving on to a more complex environment for my production, what I would probably have perhaps is another 5 or 6 machines dedicated to supporting my production environment that I deploy to. We can see here in development that I have 4 components that I am deploying onto that physical machine. What I might find for my production environment is that actually these 3 components of my worldwide travel application actually go onto different machines in production. Well, that's fine, because I can map them in that way in this type of screen here and map those individual components to specific resources. But the underlying processes that I use to perform the deployment operations don't change at all. That's one of the great characteristics about this solution, in that we have a single way of operating, whether you are deploying to a single box for development purposes or 20, 30, 40, 50 machines that you may be deploying to in a production environment. It's the same process. The failure of many DevOps solutions that we see, where customers have sort of handcrafted their own scripted operations, the failure that we find is that when you ask customers, how do you test your development process? How do you test the process that deploys into production? And the only answer that the customer can give you is in deploying to production. That's the only answer they can credibly give, because the IP addresses are different, the way that the components are fragmented across the environment in production is different. The only way to test that is by deploying into production, and that shouldn't really be the case. So what we want to ensure we have is a consistent process for deployment that is exactly the same across all environments that we have. Now I'm going to dive into the application now. So let's dig into our applications by going to the Applications tab. We have 2 applications listed here. We have one called simply the sample application, and the other one is Deploy the Worldwide Travel application. So let's go into the Worldwide Travel and have a look at this. Well, we get a number of tabs across the screen, across here, this particular area, showing us the different capabilities that we can perform on our application called Deploy Worldwide Travel. The first thing that we met with there, the most colorful part of the solution probably, is the environments that we can deploy onto. And we can see that we've got 4 environments listed there. They are development, integration test, pre-production test, and production. So we've got a variety of different environments that we can deploy onto. Now if I open up one of those environments, what we'll see is we'll see the components that exist within that particular environment. So we'll see that for this particular application has been broken down into 3 components, one for booking, one for web content, and one for administration. And it tells us straight away that within the development environment, we've got version 1.1 of booking, 1.1 of web content, and 1.0 of administration. And that starts to provide some very useful information that teams may struggle to find elsewhere. Is let's go and have a look at what we've currently got running in development. Let's also open up my integration test environment and have a look at what we've got running in there. Slightly different version numbers. So we can start to see the content differences between the two environments. Now that's doing it by eye, and I can open up my other environments. I haven't deployed anything to pre-production or production actually in here. We can start to open up various different environments and scroll down and see what versions of components have been deployed to where. We can do that in a slightly better way, because you might be thinking, well, that looks okay, but we've got 50 components that we want to deploy. So I don't really want to be sort of lining them all up by eye and trying to do that sort of comparison. So let's compare the development environment with another environment, and we're going to pick integration test. And when we look at this comparison view now, what we see is that actually the administration function and the web content are the same, but on the booking side of things, we've got version 1.1 in development, 1.0 in integration test. It's kind of an a view that we would expect to have, because our integration test environment is slightly behind development, and that's probably what we would expect to have. If we go back to look at these two environments again, there's further information shown here that's particularly useful, and we have the differences in the properties. So it tells us that we had version 5 of the property set for the booking, version 3 for web content, and 2 for administration. And similarly, we've got some different values shown down here for integration test. Now, properties are very, very important to UrbanCode Deploy, in that we meet lots of customers who talk to us about the different parameters that they have that they need to use to parameterize their applications, to provide different settings and different properties for each particular component. Now, all of those settings can be held within UrbanCode Deploy. They can actually also be held as file content and managed outside of Deploy as well. There's a variety of different ways that you can solve that particular problem, but there are it's recognized that management of properties and management of such content is very, very important between these environments. So let's go back to our compare again. And this time what I want to show you is that we have the ability to look at the difference between those properties, between those configurations. And what we can see here is that we've got a port and a server setting. This is a very simple Tomcat application. And down here what I have is I've got 2 instances of Tomcat running on this particular machine on different port numbers. And you can see those port numbers here. So we've got in development, our environment is using port 8070. For integration test, it's using port 8082. Now, that's a very simple example, but you can probably think of areas within your own applications where you have different settings between development, integration test, production, pre-production, and so on. Managing the IP address changes between those environments can be very difficult, and it can be quite a challenge to manage those in files or in other places, and just identifying what was deployed, going back to a test environment and verifying that can take an awful lot of time. So having the ability to manage those deployments here and manage looking at the differences between those environments is very, very useful to have. So that's really introducing the concept of the different environments that we can deploy into, and how we show the differences that naturally will exist between those environments. So what I want to do now is show you how we actually do some deployment. And I can do this by going into the process part of this particular application. Now, this shows here the process detail for deploying this particular application. Now, bear in mind that an application is made up of multiple components. Really what we're looking at here is just the orchestration layer that tells us that we need to deploy that particular component. Then we deploy that component, and so on through the life cycle. And here what we've got is the deployment of the administration function. At the same time, we're going to deploy the web content, and when the administration function is finished deploying, we're going to deploy the booking system. Now, this is a little bit artificial, I know, but you can probably think of things in your own environment where there are maybe 2, 3, 10 things that can happen in parallel, but then there might be something else that needs to happen sequentially after another change has been applied, particularly database changes if you segment those out. into a variety of different things. Let's look at the detail of one of these items by clicking on the pencil here. And what this does is shows us the properties panel for that particular deployment. And we can see that it has a name that's been displayed previously. It identifies a particular component, Worldwide Travel Administration, and it identifies a component process within there called Deploy to Tomcat. Now we can have multiple processes in each individual component. So we might have deploy everything, we might have deploy a partial amount of it if content already exists. We might have a rollback function that we call if something goes wrong and we've had a failure occur. So there's multiple processes that we can call from within here. So this is very simple. These always are very simple, these processes that we have at this level here, where it's really just deciding the running order of a series of operations that we perform on our components. Now I want to go ahead and have a look at an individual component now. So let's go into that Worldwide Travel Administration function, that particular component, and let's go straight in to look at the process of this particular component. So here we have a little bit more detail. This is deploying a very simple Tomcat application, and these building blocks that we have on screen here are different operations that are performed on the content or on the Tomcat application server itself to initiate the deployment. And let me just take you through what these steps are through here. So we download the artifacts. The first thing this will do is it will download the version of the component artifacts that we have selected to use within this particular deployment. The next thing it will do is it will stop the application running. Let's go and have a look at the detail of this one. So in here now we see the properties for this particular step, and in this it identifies the Tomcat Manager URL. Now if you remember back to where I was showing you the sort of parameterization of this and the differences between the development and the integration test environment, we were looking at a server name and a port number. This is how we use them. So we have this syntax of $ curly bracket p colon environment / server end curly bracket. Bit of a mouthful, I know, but it's a very straightforward way to identify the scope of a parameter. In this case, the scope is the environment. It's an environment specific parameter, and the name of the parameter is server. So we know now that whichever environment we are running this through, we will go and look up the server parameter specified within that particular environment, and we'll use that here during that deployment. So parameterizing these deployments is really important. We have a few other things that we identify that you're probably familiar with and you would expect us to need: a Tomcat user and a password, which is hidden, and the context name. And all of the other parameters through here have very, very similar properties. But if we browse through the content that we have down here in this left-hand side browser, you can start to see that we have a variety of different plugins available for different environments. So we have WebSphere MQ, we have WebSphere Message Broker, we have scripting, so we can run any type of shell script operation just by dragging this one on screen here, and we can see the shell script that we would run there. It's very easy to add on these additional processes. Shell scripting really gives us a bit of a catch-all. If we don't have a plugin to cover your particular technology, and bearing in mind that we have over 60 plugins now to cover various different systems, then we use scripted operations to catch up with it. We also link into other things that are really not just about deployment. If we look at things like issue tracking, we can update the status update an issue from a JIRA ticket if we want to. We can update Rational Team Concert work items. So it's a great way to provide feedback on the results of deployment, even to people that are not necessarily using the tool. Now, there's something specific I want to point out here. There's a big red no entry sign that's glaring out of the screen that's probably caught your eye. What this means basically is when we try and stop the application running, if it fails, go down this line here and then just deploy the application to the Tomcat server. The assumption there is that we've tried to stop it, that's failed, it probably isn't installed at all. If the stop is successful, we go down this line here, we'll then undeploy the application. and then we'll go up here to deploy the new one and start the application, and the job is done. Now, a lot of customers use these here, these red no entry signs, to catch any errors. We get a lot of sort of defensive programming techniques introduced in deployment operations, and there's a good opportunity to create specific steps that we go to that maybe raise JIRA tickets, raise rational team concept tickets, send notifications to people if something has failed, and then stop the operation. Now, there's a few other things that I'd like to show you about this particular component. I'm going to introduce one of them briefly just now, which is to go and have a look at the configuration of the component. And what we'll see here is that there are a variety of different mechanisms that we can use to pull in the content or the artifacts of this particular component. So we've got links into various source code management systems, links into various build systems, and we also have basically just a version file system. So what this means is that we are expecting to find new content under this particular location on this machine, and we will import new content that appears there, and that will become a new version of this particular artifact. Let's just go and have a quick look at the versions, and then we're going to go and run a deployment. And for this one, we see that we have version 1.0 that's been marked as ready for integration. Now, these are really important, these status symbols, because we can use these statuses to govern what content is available to be deployed to a particular environment. So if we go and have a look at another version, another component, let me find the right one I'm looking for a second. Go and have a look at our administration component and have a look at the versions that exist in there. We have one of those. Oh, that's the one I want. There it is. So if we go and have a look at our web content, I've forgotten which component had got multiple versions, but here if we look at the web content component, we have version 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. Only one of those has been marked as ready for integration, and that's really important because without that marker, we have a gate system on our integration environment that means that if that stamp hasn't been applied, no versions are going to get deployed into our integration test. It has to have that quality marker on. Now, from a governance perspective, what we can do is we can control who is allowed to put those status markers on. So we have very clear controls over who marks content ready for specific environments. And when you're getting up to production environments, that is really, really important. So let's go back into our application and have a look at some deployments that have run. I'm going to go and have a look at the history of this particular deployment. I'm not going to click and run a deployment now because really that's just watching things happen. I'm going to show you the results of this deployment, and then I'm going to hand back to Helen to finish things off. So you saw me talk earlier on about the steps that we went through for deploying to Tomcat. We downloaded the artifacts, we stopped the application, we deployed the application, we undeployed the application, deployed the new one, and then we started the application. And we can look at the details of these operations by clicking on this little black command window here. And that shows us the things that would normally be echoed to screen if we typed in at the command line the operations to perform that using a command line tools. So we can see the results of stopping that particular application. Let's go and have a look at the deploy step and have a look at that. And we can see that we've successfully deployed the application at that particular context path. So there's the sorts of results that we get through the multiple steps of the application. If we open up the one for the deployed web content as well, we'll see similar results down here. But if you look at the times, the deployment of the administration started at 13:26:53. So did this one. These were the two things that we had running in parallel together earlier on today. And if we look at the deploying the web component, that one runs a little bit later on. So we can see the parallel nature of these deployments. We can watch these in real time as they are progressing through, and these individual steps will update, will show us the success of the operations as they go through. And it's a great way to keep track of the complex deployment scenarios that you are likely to go through. So let me just quickly summarize what we've tried to show here today. We tried to introduce the concept of the resources and the mechanisms for managing the infrastructure and the operational side of the deployments. We then looked at an individual application that we chose to deploy, how that was broken down into a number of different components, how the orchestration of the deployment of those components is managed with an application process. We then looked at an individual component and dived in deeply into the component process and discussed the 60 or so component plugins that we have for deploying to different technologies. Identified how we can draw new versions of a component in and then manage those versions with status markers so that only approved content actually gets deployed to an environment. And then finished off by looking at the results of running one of these deployments and the fine-grained detail that we can have. So that's really all I wanted to cover today. This is a quick introduction to UrbanCode Deploy. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, there's a huge amount of content left that I could explain in another session. So we probably will be doing a follow-up session to this, hopefully in the future, to go a little bit deeper. But for now, I'll just hand back to Helen to finish off this session.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. So I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you again at quite a high level to the Range for DevOps Readiness Assessment. This is a piece of consulting that we offer to customers. We have lots of customers who aren't the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Googles of this world and haven't been doing DevOps for years and do recognise that there are perhaps conflicts in their organisation between their development and operations teams as businesses putting more pressure on them to do more innovation. And perhaps they recognise that there's things that they could be doing a lot faster through automation and using tools like UrbanCode that Mark has just shown you. But a lot of people don't really know where to start, and we get asked a lot on where to start, and the answer's never in the same place. So we produce this piece of consulting to help our customers build a roadmap on how to get to a DevOps environment. Like most DevOps experts in the market today, we don't think that DevOps is a tool or even a person. It's a movement, it's a cultural change. So it's quite high level, this piece of consultancy. It follows a mantra that we have lived by for years, whilst we've been doing application lifecycle management tooling and implementations for a long time, which is people, process, tools. And we're also very focused on an acronym that John Willis, a very famous DevOps guru, coined, which is CAMS, which is all about culture, automation, measurement and metrics and sharing. And for us, a really key part of this assessment is getting the metrics right. So the very first thing we try and do is baseline where a business is today. And then we start working with the business to look at visualize the future desired state, so where they want to be. And we'll talk a little bit more about often where that final state is in a moment. But again, when we're looking at the future desired state, we try and identify metrics that can be quantified, so very firm metrics, things like number of releases, time of releases, number of defects, mean time to repair, various different metrics we can use that can track the success of the project as it's being delivered and give people an opportunity to celebrate success when they reach their goals. So as part of the assessment process, what we produce is a roadmap to adoption, so to get our customers to their desired state. So as I just said, the first thing we do over to the left here is we baseline the existing state, and then we, with the project stakeholders, we visualise the desired future state. And I mentioned this is a 10-day bit of consulting. It's normally elapses over a couple of weeks and has 2 consultants performing 5 days consulting each. So there's a day or so of prep, and then we start with a half-day project kickoff with the key stakeholders. And this is where we start really understanding where they're at and where they want to be. The next thing that happens is around a day and a half of both consultants interviewing up to 12 personnel of the organisation's IT teams, but not always just the IT teams. Quite often we involve the business as well. So it'll be obviously the development operations staff, but also potentially InfoSec, DBAs, the business sponsors, anyone else that an organisation feels is involved in the process. And this assessment also works with a great many of our customers who have outsourced either or both of their development and operation teams. We just need stakeholders to mandate the involvement of the characters that they feel should be involved. So once we've got the vision of the desired state, we can then start thinking about the appropriate initiatives around the organisation and the culture that we're going to help move this project forward. And then think about the process and technology around that and any imperatives around the architecture. And we perform a fit assessment on this. So what we often find is that people want quick wins, and that's good because it shows success and it gets everyone in the correct, enthused and motivated mindset. However, it's often the more difficult projects that will offer more value in the long term. So it's really important to be able to prioritise these projects so people feel that they're winning, but they also can report back some great value gains. So on the right of this slide, we've got an example of what an approved project plan might look like. And in the red box down the bottom, you'll see it says continuous delivery. And I mentioned on the previous slide that we would talk a little bit more about the vision of desired future state. And continuous delivery is often that point where people want to end up. So similar to what Mark was just showing you in UrbanCode, the ability to for the developers to commit code and that to go through into production and have a number of automated steps that make sure that that code is fully tested and defect free when it reaches an organisation's customers. So that is the DevOps readiness assessment. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, please do get in touch with us. You can find us at www.ranger4.com. You can find all our contact details there. So all that remains for today is for me to thank Mark very much for his time. Thank you, Mark. And to invite you all back to another Ranger 4 webcast another day. And as Mark said, we will do a deeper dive follow-up at some point. So hopefully see you then.